Assalamualaikum et bonjour. Today we are going to learn the passé composé. Okay, for your information, there will be two parts of clips dedicated for passé composé. We will look at the definition of passé composé. Then we are going to look at how we are going to use it in a sentence. Well, in this first part, we are going to look at how passé composé is made of, okay? How it is formed or constructed. And what are the components needed to form a passé composé. And the most essential part in this clip is to explain when do we use passé composé. Okay, either auxiliary avoir, and when do we use passé composé with auxiliary être? Okay. And what are the two exceptions for verbs using auxiliary être? Okay. Well, right? Alright, so now let's get started. Passé composé, okay, you have here passé composé, is known as past tense in English. Before we learn how to conjugate passé composé, we need to know few things. Okay, the first one, what is a passé composé? Okay. Second, when do we use passé composé? Alright. Past tense is one of the past tenses that you will use in the most of the cases, since it is one of the past tenses that we use to express what we have been doing for the weekend, for example. Okay? It is the past which is not that far. For example, you have last weekend, last week, and even last month. And if you are talking about what occurred in your childhood, for example, which happened long time ago, we will not be using passé composé. We will be using another tense which is imparfait. Okay. To summarize, passé composé is used to express what we have been doing in the past which is not that far. And it is to tell a sequence of events in the past, one-time event, specific event that happens at a certain time. For example, I ate an apple. So, j'ai mangé une pomme. So, now let's look at how passé composé is made of. Okay, right. You have two parts. The first part, okay, is auxiliary. So here is written two components. Okay, you have two components are needed to form French passé composé. So you have the first part. Okay, so this is the first part. Auxiliary avoir or être. Okay, so you have two choices, either auxiliary avoir or être, and the second part is past participle. It is the main verb. Okay. For auxiliary, you have a choice between être or avoir. Okay. Most of the verbs for passé composé are constructed with auxiliary avoir, and some of the verbs are constructed with auxiliary verb être. Okay. And it will be the exceptions for passé composé. Okay, so we're going to look at the exceptions later on. And we are going to look at the list of the verbs which usually use auxiliary être and how it is conjugated as well. Okay, for the main verb, we will conjugate it to past participle. So this one. Right. Now, in this chart, okay, now look, in this chart, we're going to look at the transition of the sentences in present tense to passé composé. Here we have 3 examples of sentences which have been transformed from present tense to passé composé. So you have je regarde un film, je regarde un film, I watch a film, becomes j'ai regardé un film, I have watched a film or a movie. Right? So look at the transition. You have tu achètes une jupe, you buy a skirt, becomes tu as acheté une jupe. And the last transition is je vais à Paris, I go to Paris, becomes je suis allé à Paris. So from I come to Paris, so I go to Paris becomes I went to Paris. If you look closely, the first 2 sentences are using auxiliary avoir, but the third sentence use the auxiliary être. Okay, so here you have avoir, and here you have être. Right? So you have avoir, and here you have être. Okay, all right. Later we will look why most verbs are using auxiliary avoir and why some of the verbs are using auxiliary être. Okay, now let's look at this. Okay, so here you have the components which are important. You have the first one, auxiliary avoir or être, dan participe passé to form a passé composé. Alright, you see that? Okay, now let's look at the 2 exceptions. This is the first exception. The verbs which use auxiliary être to form a passé composé. So the first exception is all the verbs listed below. It uses auxiliary être. So here you have aller means to go, arriver to arrive, descendre to go down, devenir to become, entrer to enter, monter to go up, mourir to die, naître to born, partir to leave, rester to stay, retourner to return, sortir to go out, tomber to fall down, and venir to come. So all these verbs here are the exceptions, and they use auxiliary être. Alright? To form passé composé in French. So now let's move to the second exception, which will be using auxiliary être as well. So this is the first one, yeah? So the second one is this verb. This is not foreign to you. You have seen this in chapter 3. It is called verb pronominal. Right? So all the verbs in pronominal, either reflexive or reciprocal verbs, which we have just learned in chapter 3, use auxiliary être. Okay? They use auxiliary être at all time. And how do you know it is pronominal? By looking at the way it is constructed, you have se here. Okay? Right? For example, you have se laver, to wash, and s'habiller, to get dressed. Okay, now. Alright. Okay, so I hope you are able to get the gist of what is a verb passé composé. Okay, in this first clip, part 1. And why do we use these verbs in describing what we have done, which is not that far, okay? What we have done, which is not that far, okay? Like last weekend, okay? Last month, okay? Right? Now, which verbs are constructed with auxiliary être and which one is constructed with auxiliary avoir? This is the main idea that all that you need to understand in part 1 of this clip, alright? And also, how passé composé is constructed and what are the main components of passé composé. Remember, you have auxiliary, avoir or être, and past participle. Well, do ask questions if you feel the need to do so. I am wishing all of you bon courage, Bonne continuation et merci beaucoup. Au revoir.